A courtroom filled with tension, the air thick with the weight of legal proceedings. Suddenly, the sound of a bark breaks the silence. Not just one bark, but three. A stray dog, wandering into the courtroom, unknowingly sets the stage for an unforgettable moment. But what happens next? The moment when the room goes completely still, and the judge, the lawyers, and even the audience are left in shock. How could a simple dog disrupt such a serious atmosphere? And what was it that stopped everyone in their tracks? Stick around to the end of this video to uncover this heartwarming yet dramatic twist. In today's video, we're going to dive into an amazing story where a stray dog interrupts a courtroom, an interruption that led to a shocking yet heartwarming turn of events. We'll break down the fascinating chain of events and discuss the larger lessons about compassion, empathy, and the unexpected ways life can surprise us. This isn't just a story about a dog, it's a story about humanity, understanding, and moments that can forever change us. So, let's dive in. Imagine the scene: a courtroom filled with the usual tension of legal proceedings. The judge is seated at the front, his gavel resting in front of him, his sharp eyes focused on the matter at hand. Lawyers stand at either side, each waiting their turn to present their arguments. The air is thick with formality. This is not a place for distractions. This is a place where decisions are made, decisions that could change lives forever. It is a place of structure and order, where the rules are followed and every word is measured, every gesture calculated, every action is bound by protocol. A place where time seems to stretch, each minute carrying the weight of consequences. But suddenly, there is a shift, something unexpected, something that doesn't belong in this formal environment intrudes. A noise, a bark. It cuts through the silence like a sharp blade, breaking the stillness that had filled the room. It's a sound that immediately shifts the energy of the space. The judge, with his usually stern expression, pauses, looking up with surprise. The lawyers stop mid-sentence, their words hanging in the air as they turn their heads in disbelief. The audience, too, is taken aback. They don't know what to make of it. Was it a mistake? A misunderstanding? Perhaps the sound was coming from outside the courtroom. But then it happens again. Another bark, louder this time. The dog, it seems, has found its voice. And so, a third bark rings out. This time, it's not just a noise. It's an interruption, an undeniable presence. The dog has made its entrance, and there's no going back now. At first, it might seem like a minor inconvenience, something that will soon be addressed and brushed aside. After all, a dog is just a dog, right? Perhaps it's an innocent creature that has wandered into the courtroom, maybe searching for food or warmth. The dog doesn't seem to have any malicious intent. It's just there, in the space, disrupting the formalities of the court in a way no one had anticipated. But what happens next is anything but ordinary. This stray dog doesn't simply bark and leave. It doesn't run out the door in search of its next adventure. No, the dog stays. It lingers. The barking, it turns out, is not just an inconvenience. It's the beginning of something much larger. The courtroom, once full of authority and rules, begins to shift in subtle but undeniable ways. The people in that room, those who were once wrapped up in the seriousness of the case at hand, start to look at each other, their expressions filled with confusion, curiosity, and even a hint of wonder. You see, there is something powerful in the simplicity of this moment, something profound in the way this stray dog, with no agenda, no knowledge of the legal world it has wandered into, has managed to capture the attention of everyone present. In that instant, the formality of the courtroom seems to fade away. The people in the room, so focused on their tasks just moments before, are now united in their shared experience of being caught off guard by this unexpected visitor. It's as if the dog, with its pure and unfiltered presence, has reminded them all that life doesn't always follow the script. And that's what makes this moment so intriguing. In a place where the most important decisions are often made with careful thought and deliberation, the arrival of a stray dog throws everything off balance. No one was prepared for this. No one could have anticipated that a dog, a simple creature wandering through the world, would come into this formal, structured space and alter the very energy of the room. The barks are not just an interruption. They're a challenge to the routine, a reminder that not everything can be planned or controlled. As the barking continues, the audience in the courtroom begins to exchange glances. Some are clearly amused by the situation, while others look confused or even irritated. After all, this is a place of business, of important legal matters. Time is precious here. Lives are at stake. There's no room for distractions, for interruptions. And yet, here is this dog, barking without a care in the world. It's as though the dog is saying, "I am here, and I will be heard." And in that moment, the usual rules of the courtroom, rules about silence, order, and control, no longer seem so important. What's fascinating about this interruption is the way it shifts the mood of the entire space. Initially, the barking seems like nothing more than an annoyance. But soon, something begins to change. The longer the dog stays, the more everyone in the courtroom begins to take notice. It's as if the dog is slowly drawing the attention of everyone, forcing them to stop what they are doing and pay attention. The formality that once dominated the room begins to dissipate, replaced by something else: curiosity. And as the dog barks a third time, something even more unexpected happens. You see, the courtroom, which is usually so rigid and predictable, becomes fluid in that moment. The barks, as simple as they are, begin to unravel the carefully constructed atmosphere of control that the court had tried to maintain. It's a strange feeling, this shift in the air. It's not something that anyone expected, and yet it's undeniable. The dog has made its presence felt in a way that no one could have anticipated. In that moment, the formality of the courtroom seems almost laughable in contrast to the simple, unfiltered existence of the dog. There's something beautiful in the dog's carefree nature, something raw and real that the legal proceedings can't replicate. This moment, strange as it is, serves as a reminder of life's unpredictability. It doesn't matter how carefully you plan or how much control you think you have over a situation. Life has a way of surprising you. And sometimes, that surprise comes in the form of something as simple as a dog barking in the middle of a courtroom. As the dog continues to wander around, it becomes clear that this is no ordinary interruption. It's not just a dog making noise. It's a dog that is making everyone stop and rethink their place in this space. The courtroom, which had been so focused on the legal process, suddenly becomes a space of reflection. What's really important here? What matters in this room, in this moment? Is it the case at hand, or is it something more? A reminder that we are all part of a much larger world, one where even the simplest creatures have a role to play. The dog doesn't know any of this, of course. It doesn't know that it's causing a stir, that it's altering the course of the proceedings. All the dog knows is that it's found a place to be, and it's making itself heard. And in doing so, it's changing the way everyone in that room sees the world around them. It's forcing them to pause, to reconsider their priorities, to take a moment to notice the things that are easy to overlook. This stray dog, with its 3 barks, has become a symbol of something greater than itself. It has reminded the people in that courtroom that life is not always predictable. It has shown them that sometimes the most meaningful moments come when we least expect them, when the noise of our daily lives is interrupted by something unexpected, something that demands our attention. The dog has disrupted the routine, yes, but it has also reminded everyone in that room of the value of pausing, of reflecting, and of recognizing the world around us, even in the most unlikely places. The moment that the stray dog barked for the second time in the courtroom, something shifted. It wasn't just the sound that echoed through the room, but the undeniable force it carried. At first, the lawyers and judge exchanged looks, unsure of how to react to the disruption. Could this simply be a stray animal wandering into the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was it something more profound, something that carried an invisible weight, perhaps a message or a reminder from the universe? The second bark had a tone that was different from the first. It wasn't just a random noise anymore. It was deliberate, almost as if the dog was speaking directly to those present. It's easy to dismiss the actions of animals, especially when they don't fit into our organized world of rules and structures. But as that second bark echoed through the courtroom, something subtle happened. The momentary confusion that followed the first bark transformed into a kind of awareness. People began to realize that this wasn't simply an accident. This dog, somehow, had made its way into one of the most serious, rule-bound places in society, and its presence couldn't be ignored. People were used to hearing barking in more familiar settings, outside on the streets in neighborhoods, but not in a courtroom, a place where the seriousness of law and justice was at the forefront. The law was designed to be objective, to create clarity and certainty. Yet here was this creature, a stray with no agenda or knowledge of the formalities of the world, disrupting that order with a simple and unmistakable bark. The bark itself wasn't the only thing that caused a stir. It was the timing. In that precise moment, a strange tension had been building in the courtroom. A case was likely reaching a critical point, where decisions would be made, where lives might be altered. Tensions were already high, and the last thing anyone expected was the presence of an animal who had no understanding of the gravity of what was happening around it. The dog, though, had a presence, a rawness, a kind of honesty in its intrusion that no one could ignore. The courtroom, once filled with the dry hum of legal arguments and formalities, was now quiet, punctuated only by the startling sound of this stray dog. The second bark was louder and more insistent than the first, and it had an almost commanding quality. It was as though the dog was trying to make itself heard, to claim its space in a world that often overlooked creatures like it. And in that moment, a strange shift occurred in the people sitting in that room. The focus of the courtroom was no longer entirely on the case at hand. In fact, for a brief moment, the case seemed secondary. The dog had captured the attention of everyone, and it wasn't letting go. The sharpness of the barks had a certain power to them that was impossible to ignore. It was as if the dog was trying to convey something to the people in that room, trying to communicate something deeper that words and legal jargon could never express. For the judge, a person used to commanding respect and silence, the barks were jarring. His usual composure seemed less certain, less controlled, as he turned his attention to the dog. The bark itself wasn't threatening, but there was an undeniable force behind it, a rawness that made it impossible for anyone in the room to stay entirely focused on the matter at hand. The lawyers, who typically spend their lives trying to control conversations and ensure that their points are heard, were now completely sidelined by the dog's presence. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't dominated by the legal process. Instead, it was as if the rules had been momentarily suspended and the dog had taken over, calling for attention in a way that couldn't be easily dismissed. The audience, too, was drawn into the moment. The people in the room, many of whom may have come with their own expectations, suddenly found themselves caught in a shared experience. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about the dog. How strange, how curious, that this small creature, so insignificant in comparison to the case that was being presented, could capture the focus of an entire room. What made it all the more curious was that despite the obvious interruption, no one seemed to have the heart to remove the dog. It wasn't a nuisance in the traditional sense. There was no malice in the dog's actions, no intention to disrupt or to cause harm. It was just there. It was as though the dog had been invited into this space, as though it belonged, even though it most certainly did not. And with that second bark, the courtroom's atmosphere began to change. It wasn't just the sound that had shifted things, it was the very sense of what was happening. For a brief, fleeting moment, the lawyers, the judge, and the audience all shared a realization that they were all part of a much larger story, a story that didn't revolve around the case or the law, but around something more universal: the unexpected, the unplanned, the uninvited. What's remarkable about that second bark is how it highlights the contrast between the order and rigidity of the courtroom and the wild, unpredictable nature of life outside its walls. The courtroom represents structure, rules, and precision. The dog represents life's unpredictability, something that can't be planned or controlled. And in that moment, the two worlds collided. The dog, with its raw and untamed existence, became the perfect symbol of how life refuses to be contained within the boundaries we try to set for it. The judge, the lawyers, and even the audience were all forced to stop and question what mattered. The dog's bark, simple and straightforward, disrupted the expectation that life should be orderly, that it should be calm and controlled. The more the dog barked, the more it seemed to demand attention, as if trying to push back against the confines of the courtroom. It wasn't just interrupting. It was challenging the norms that had been established. It was asking the people in that room to think beyond their roles, to think beyond the case they were discussing, and to consider something else, something more fundamental, something raw. For the briefest of moments, the courtroom was not a place of legal battles, but a space where the unexplainable had its chance to speak. In a way, it was as if the dog had become a conduit for something much bigger than anyone realized. It was reminding the people in that room that life itself is unpredictable, that the story isn't always about control, but about the moments that surprise us, that shake us, that pull us out of our routine and make us rethink everything. And yet, it wasn't just about the dog. It was also about the people in the room. How did they respond to this interruption? What did it say about them, about their values and their priorities? The way they reacted to the barking would tell a story about their own perspective on life. Were they irritated by the dog's presence? Were they annoyed by the disruption? Or were they perhaps, like some of the others in the room, starting to see the deeper meaning in what was happening? The dog's second bark was louder and more demanding, and with it came a challenge to everyone who heard it. It demanded presence, it demanded acknowledgement, and in that moment, the courtroom was forced to recognize that no matter how much order or structure they imposed, the world was not something they could completely control. Life, in all its complexity, would continue to surprise them. The dog's actions became more than an inconvenience. They became a symbol of the unpredictability of life. A symbol that no matter how much we plan, how much we try to control every detail, we are never truly in charge. Sometimes, life surprises us in ways we never saw coming, and we have to learn to navigate it with grace and understanding. The barking wasn't just noise. It was a reminder that we are part of something much bigger, something unpredictable, something beyond our understanding. And as the courtroom slowly shifted from confusion to reflection, the second bark seemed to speak louder than all the legal arguments combined. The dog had found its voice, and it had something important to say. As the third bark echoed through the courtroom, a heavy silence descended. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows a dramatic pause in a movie or a theatrical performance. No, this was a deep, almost suffocating stillness. The barks had already created a stir, yes, but it was the third that truly transformed the atmosphere. This was no longer just an interruption, it was a turning point. The entire room seemed to freeze in that moment, as if time itself had momentarily come to a halt. What happened in the wake of that third bark was nothing short of remarkable. The judge, who had been preparing to make his next ruling, sat back in his chair, his usual stern demeanor giving way to something more perplexed, almost uncertain. His gaze shifted from the dog to the faces of the people around him. The lawyers, too, seemed unsure how to proceed. They paused, caught off guard by the unexpected presence of the animal. Their arguments had been interrupted, their rhythm disturbed. The audience, typically passive observers of the proceedings, were now leaning forward, drawn into a shared, collective moment of bewilderment. It wasn't just the dog's bark that had them in suspense, it was the silence that followed. For a brief moment, the room was suspended in time. No one knew what to do next. There was a strange power in that silence, one that felt heavier than the barks themselves. It wasn't just the dog's presence in the courtroom that had caused this reaction, it was the undeniable force with which it had captured everyone's attention. There was something about the rawness of the interruption that made it impossible for the room to ignore. It was as though, in that single moment, the dog had become a mirror to everyone's inner thoughts and feelings. As the seconds ticked by, the judge cleared his throat, a slight gesture that seemed to bring everyone back to reality. But even then, the tension lingered. It wasn't as simple as a courtroom being disrupted by an animal. No, this was more profound. The third bark had done something that could not easily be undone. It had created a shared experience that bonded everyone in that room together, whether they realized it or not. It was the kind of moment that could not be neatly filed away under the usual events of a courtroom. It was the kind of thing that would be remembered long after the case at hand was over. The question lingered in the air. Why had this happened? Why had this stray dog wandered into the courtroom at this particular moment? It could have been any day, any case, but this was the day, and this was the case where the dog had made its entrance. Its timing seemed almost uncanny, and the result of its interruption was nothing less than profound. In the minutes that followed, the dog continued to sit in the center of the room, a quiet, almost regal presence despite its disheveled appearance. There was something striking about the way the dog simply existed in that space, undisturbed by the formality of the courtroom, as though it didn't know or care about the weight of the proceedings. And yet, it had managed to stop everything. It had frozen a room full of people, caused them to pause in their tracks and reconsider what was important. In the grand scheme of things, The case at hand seemed almost insignificant compared to the raw, unvarnished presence of the dog. The longer the dog remained in the room, the more people began to reflect on the strange power it held. No one in the room had expected this. There was no preparation for such a disruption. It was as if the dog had breached the walls of formality and created a new space, one where the usual rules no longer applied. This wasn't just a courtroom anymore. This was a place where the ordinary and the extraordinary collided, and the dog, in its simplicity, had become a catalyst for that collision. For the judge, who had spent his career in an environment where every word mattered, every gesture was scrutinized, the situation was perplexing. He had been trained to follow the rules, to ensure that the law was applied consistently and fairly. He had been taught to remain calm and composed, no matter what was happening in the room. But in this moment, with the dog's barks still ringing in his ears, the judge found himself confronted with something that his legal training could not prepare him for. How do you respond when the structure you rely on to maintain order and control is suddenly threatened by something as unpredictable as a stray dog? The dog, oblivious to the power it wielded, sat calmly in the middle of the room, perhaps unaware of the chaos it had caused. Its presence, however, was undeniable. And as the minutes passed, the people in the courtroom began to realize something that they might have overlooked before. They weren't just witnesses to a courtroom drama. They were also participants in something much larger, a moment of unexpected connection, a moment when the rules of the world they had built suddenly seemed less important. And so, the dog's interruption continued to reverberate in ways no one had anticipated. It wasn't just a matter of disrupting a legal case. The dog had done something far more profound. It had reminded everyone in the room that life is full of unpredictable moments, moments that can't be controlled or planned. It had brought them face to face with the uncertainty of existence, with the realization that no matter how carefully we try to structure our lives, we are never truly in control. For those in the courtroom, the dog's intrusion was a mirror to their own sense of order and chaos. It was as if the dog, in its quiet way, was showing them that life doesn't always follow the script. Sometimes, things happen that we can't explain, things that shake us to our core and make us question what we thought we knew. In the calm after the barks, the room seemed to hum with an unspoken truth, that the world, with all its rules and regulations, was never as predictable as we like to think. The dog's third bark had broken the routine, but it had also broken down the walls that separated people from each other. In that moment, the people in the room, whether they realized it or not, were united by the sheer absurdity of the situation. It didn't matter what side of the case they were on, or what their personal beliefs were. For those brief seconds, they were all caught in the same unexpected event, sharing in the same confusion, the same wonder, the same disbelief. The dog had, in essence, become the great equalizer. It didn't care about the case, the judge, the lawyers, or the audience. It didn't know that its presence had created such a stir. It had simply acted in accordance with its own instincts, its own needs, and in doing so, it had shattered the illusion of control that everyone in the room had relied on. The third bark, in its raw simplicity, had brought the room to a standstill, forcing everyone to confront the unpredictable nature of life itself. As the judge slowly regained his composure, there was a moment of quiet reflection that passed over the room. The weight of the situation lingered. It wasn't just about a stray dog that had wandered into a courtroom. It was about everything the dog had inadvertently forced them to consider. What had seemed like a routine case, with its rigid structures and formalities, had been interrupted by something that could not be ignored, something that spoke to the very heart of what it meant to be alive. The dog had created a pause, a space in time where everyone could reflect on the nature of control, the nature of order, and the nature of life itself. And just as quickly as it had come, the moment seemed to pass. The dog remained in the courtroom, still unaware of the profound impact it had made, and yet its presence lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The lawyers began to resume their arguments. The judge took a moment to regain his usual composure, and the audience, though still shaken by the event, returned to their places. But something had changed. The room, once filled with the noise of legal proceedings, now seemed quieter, more thoughtful. The dog's bark had forced everyone to stop and consider what really mattered. And though the case would eventually move forward, the weight of that brief, powerful moment would remain in the minds of all who had witnessed it. The dog had interrupted a courtroom, but in doing so, it had created something much more lasting. A moment of reflection, a reminder of life's unpredictability, and a shared experience that transcended the formalities of law and order. And though the proceedings would continue, the courtroom would never quite be the same. As the proceedings resumed in the courtroom, the presence of the stray dog still lingered in the air. Though the bark had been silenced, the moment itself was far from over. The people in the room had been fundamentally altered by what they had witnessed. The interruption had done something more than disrupt the flow of the case. It had opened a door to deeper reflections, to questions that no one had considered before. The dog had reminded them of a truth that they had forgotten in the hustle and bustle of their lives, that life is unpredictable, that it is not something to be controlled, but something to be navigated with an openness to the unknown. As the judge tried to regain his usual composure, his hand resting on the gavel, there was an evident change in his demeanor. The usual sense of control and authority that defined his every move seemed slightly diminished, not in weakness, but in the acknowledgement that even he, the one in charge, could not control everything. It was as if the dog had taught him something about the fragility of power, the limits of influence, and the humility that comes with the realization that there are forces in the world far beyond our reach. The lawyers, too, seemed somewhat unsettled. They were used to commanding attention, to controlling the flow of discussion with their legal expertise. But in that moment, they were forced to accept that not all things can be neatly packaged, and not all conversations can be steered in the direction they wish. The barks of a stray dog had proven this in the most undeniable way. They had shown without words that even in a room designed for logic and reason, something entirely irrational, something as simple as an animal's bark, could disrupt everything. In the courtroom, a space that had long been defined by its rules, the dog's intrusion had shifted the balance of power. The strict, hierarchical order of the legal system had been challenged. For a moment, the human figures of authority, the judge, the lawyers, had been on equal footing with this unpredictable creature. It was a powerful reminder of how the world outside the court was wild, uncontrolled, and often chaotic. No matter how hard we try to build structures around our lives, whether it be through the law, our professions, or even our routines, life itself remains untamed. This was a reminder that the true measure of our existence is not in the rigid systems we create, but in how we respond to the unpredictability of the world around us. The audience, too, had been impacted. At first, they had been mere spectators to the drama unfolding before them. But with each bark, each moment of uncertainty, they were slowly drawn into the experience. They were no longer passive bystanders, but participants in an unfolding narrative that defied expectations. The dog had created a shared moment of vulnerability. None of them had known what to expect, but in the presence of the dog's carefree interruption, they had been forced to drop their facades and engage with the moment. There was something profoundly human about that shared experience. The way that, for a fleeting moment, everyone in the room was simply there, in that place, caught up in the same unexplainable event. What's remarkable about this experience is how it serves as a reminder of the delicate balance we all try to maintain between control and chaos. We are constantly striving for order, for predictability, and for stability. The legal system, with its rules, precedents, and procedures, is a manifestation of that desire for control. We want to believe that we can foresee every outcome, that we can maintain a sense of order even in the most difficult of circumstances. But the dog, in its innocent and spontaneous interruption, stripped away that illusion. It reminded everyone that despite our best efforts to control and structure our lives, there will always be something wild, something untamed, that will slip through the cracks. And yet, this moment wasn't a tragedy or a catastrophe. Far from it. There was no anger or resentment directed at the dog. Instead, what remained was a sense of shared wonder, a collective recognition of the beauty in the chaos. The dog had been a force that disrupted the natural rhythm of the room, yes, but in doing so, it had also created something special. In that brief moment, the court was no longer a place of judgment and rigid formality. It was a place where the human experience took center stage. The dog had given everyone a moment to pause and reflect, a moment to think beyond the case at hand and to acknowledge the greater truth that life is uncertain, unpredictable, and sometimes beautifully chaotic. After the third bark, there was an undeniable sense that the courtroom would never be the same. As the judge looked out over the room, his gaze softened. The case was still important, of course, but there was something more at play now. The dog had altered the atmosphere of the courtroom in ways no one had expected. It had forced the people there to stop thinking only in terms of legal strategy and to think instead about their place in the world. The dog had disrupted their focus, but it had also opened their minds to a larger perspective, one that acknowledged the unpredictability of life and the importance of embracing moments of surprise. As the trial continued, the dog's presence lingered, but so did the lessons it had imparted. It wasn't just about the interruption, it was about what that interruption represented. The dog had, in its own way, opened up a space for deeper thought, for a re-evaluation of what truly mattered. It had reminded the people in that room that life was not about control or certainty, but about acceptance and openness to the unexpected. It was a call to embrace the moments that break our routines, that challenge our expectations, and that make us see the world in a new light. Over time, the dog would eventually be removed from the courtroom, either by an usher or perhaps taken outside by someone who had grown fond of the creature during its brief stay. But even as it left, the impact of its visit remained. The room, once filled with tension and formality, had been altered. The conversations that followed, whether about the case or about the dog, would carry a different energy. There was a quiet shift in everyone present, a recognition that while the proceedings would continue, they would do so with a new awareness, a new understanding of the unpredictability of life. And so, what had begun as an unexpected interruption had become something much more. The stray dog's barking had transcended its role as an annoyance or a disruption. It had become a catalyst for reflection, a prompt to reconsider the ways we view the world. It had shown everyone in that room that life was bigger than the confines of the courtroom, bigger than the case, bigger than the laws that governed their lives. There was a world out there, wild, untamed, and unpredictable, and it had a place, even in the most structured environments. In the end, the stray dog had given the people in the courtroom a gift, a moment of pause, a moment of clarity, and a reminder that not everything in life can be predicted or planned. Sometimes, the most important moments are the ones we don't see coming, the ones that challenge us to rethink everything we thought we knew. And while the case at hand might have continued after the dog's departure, the lesson it left behind would resonate far beyond the walls of that courtroom. So, as you reflect on this story, ask yourself, what are the moments in your life that have interrupted your routine, your expectations, your plans? Have you allowed them to shake you, to make you see things from a different perspective? Or have you brushed them aside, focused only on maintaining control? Like the people in that courtroom, we all have the opportunity to embrace the chaos, to find meaning in the unexpected, and to remember that life is not always about staying on course, but about learning how to navigate the surprises along the way.